She was a housewife in Queens, New York. She baked. She gardened. Her neighbors waved at her every morning. And for over 20 years, nobody knew. Nobody knew that this quiet, ordinary woman had once been called something far more disturbing, the Mare of Majdanek. Her real name was Hermine Braunsteiner, and the story of what she did and what was eventually done to her is one of the most haunting, complex, and morally heavy chapters in modern history. This isn't just a story about a war criminal. It's a story about how evil hides, how it smiles, how it makes you tea. Because here's the part that should make your blood run cold: Hermine Braunsteiner was found. Not by a government, not by Interpol. She was found by a single journalist walking down a street in New York City. One man, one photograph, one knock on the door. And that moment, that one knock would trigger a legal battle that shook 3 countries, redefined international law, and ended with one of the most emotionally charged trials in post-war history. But before we get to the trial, before we get to the verdict, you need to understand what she actually did. Because nothing about this story makes sense unless you first walk inside the gates of Majdanek, unless you hear what the survivors said, unless you understand what earned her that terrible nickname. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never forget her name. If you're new here, welcome to Nazi Dark History. We don't do shallow takes. We go deep. We find the human behind the headline, the story behind the verdict, and the truth behind the history books. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because once you start watching, trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Hermine Braunsteiner was born in Vienna, Austria in 1919. She grew up working class, not wealthy, not powerful, not special. She worked as a domestic servant, then as a factory worker. On paper, she was nobody, just another young woman trying to survive the chaos of pre-war Europe. In 1939, she applied to become an SS concentration camp guard. This was not a rare decision. The Reich actively recruited women as Aufseherinnen, female overseers, because male guards were not permitted inside the women's prisoner sections. She was trained at Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in the Reich, and what she learned there, she would bring to Majdanek with terrifying efficiency. Majdanek was a death camp on the outskirts of Lublin in occupied Poland. Unlike Auschwitz, it was built close to a city, close to normal life. The gas chambers and the crematoria were visible from the streets, and inside those gates, Hermine Braunsteiner was not just following orders. Survivors would later testify that she chose her cruelty, that she seemed to enjoy it. She was given the nickname the Mare, not as a compliment. She was described as physically dominating the yard, using her boots to stomp prisoners, tearing children from their mothers during selections, dragging women by their hair. One survivor described her as the most feared figure in the entire women's camp. Not the commandant, not the officers, her. When the war ended in 1945, Hermine Braunsteiner did something millions of ordinary people did: she went home. She was arrested briefly by British forces, tried in Austria in 1949, and sentenced to just 3 years in prison for her crimes at Ravensbrück. 3 years for what survivors had described. She served her sentence, was released, and the world moved on, or so it seemed. In 1958, she married a Canadian-American construction worker named Russell Ryan, a quiet man, an ordinary life. They settled in Maspeth, Queens, a working-class neighborhood in New York City. She became Hermine Ryan. She got her American citizenship in 1963. She planted flowers in her front yard. She had no criminal record in the United States. On paper, she was a perfectly normal American housewife. In 1964, a man named Simon Wiesenthal, the legendary Nazi hunter, compiled a list. He had been hunting former SS members and camp personnel for nearly 2 decades. Hermine Braunsteiner's name was on that list. He had a last known address in Austria, but she had vanished from it years ago. The trail was cold, until one journalist refused to let it go. His name was Joseph Lelyvold, a reporter for the New York Times. In 1964, acting on a tip from Wiesenthal's documentation center in Vienna, Lelewald tracked a possible address to Maspeth, Queens. He knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman answered. He asked if she was Hermine Braunsteiner. She said yes, just like that. No disguise, no denial. She had been hiding in plain sight under her married name for 16 years. Because the law had no mechanism for it. Not yet. The United States had no extradition process for Nazi war criminals at that time. She was an American citizen. She had committed no crimes on American soil. Legally, technically, there was nothing the U.S. government could do, and she knew it. When Lelewald's article ran in the New York Times, she gave interviews. She was calm, almost defiant. She called the accusations exaggerated. For 8 years, the case stalled. West Germany filed formal extradition requests. Survivor testimonies were collected. Wiesenthal pushed governments relentlessly. And slowly, painfully slowly, American law began to bend. In 1971, a federal judge ruled that Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan had obtained her citizenship fraudulently by concealing her wartime record. Her American citizenship was revoked. It was the first time in U.S. history that a naturalized citizen had been stripped of citizenship for Nazi war crimes. In 1973, she became the first person ever extradited from the United States to West Germany to face trial for war crimes. Think about what that means. No one had ever done it before. There was no template, no precedent. Lawyers argued, governments negotiated, and at the center of it all was this one woman sitting in her Queens living room, who had once decided that cruelty was a career choice. Her husband Russell Ryan stood by her through all of it. He never believed the accusations, or perhaps he chose not to. He gave interviews defending her. He called her a good woman, a loving wife, and in some strange, deeply uncomfortable way, that detail says everything about how ordinary evil can look from the outside. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look exactly like your neighbor. The Majdanek trial began in Düsseldorf, West Germany, in November 1975. It would become the longest criminal trial in German legal history, running for 6 years, involving 16 defendants and hearing testimony from over 200 witnesses. But of all the accused seated in that courtroom, none drew more attention, more survivor fury, and more international press than Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan. One by one, aging survivors took the stand. Women in their 60s and 70s, who had been teenage girls inside Majdanek's wire fences, pointed across the courtroom and described what they had seen her do. They described her stamping on prisoners with her boots. They described her grabbing children, and dragging them toward the gas chamber selections while their mothers screamed. They described a woman who did not follow orders reluctantly, a woman who volunteered for the worst tasks. She denied almost everything. She admitted being at Majdanek. She admitted her role as an overseer, but she insisted the testimonies were exaggerated, that memories had distorted over 30 years, that she had simply done her job within a system she could not control. It was the same defense that had echoed through every Nazi trial since Nuremberg. I was following orders. I was just one part of the machine. On June 30, 1981, nearly 6 years after the trial began, the verdicts came down. Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was found guilty of murder and joint murder in multiple cases. The court determined that she had personally participated in the selection and killing of prisoners, including children. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after the word Lebenslang, life, was read aloud. She served 13 years of that life sentence. In 1996, after her health had severely deteriorated, she was suffering from diabetes and had lost both legs to the disease. She was released on humanitarian grounds. She was 77 years old. She died in a nursing home in Bochum, Germany in April 1999. There were no flowers from survivors. There was no public mourning. There was only silence and the unbearable weight of what her freedom, even at the very end, meant to those she had harmed. Here is what Hermine Braunsteiner's case permanently changed. Her extradition from the United States set a legal precedent that no country could simply become a safe harbor for war criminals. It forced the U.S. government to create the Office of Special Investigations in 1979, a dedicated unit within the Justice Department specifically built to hunt, prosecute, and deport Nazi war criminals living in America. Hundreds of cases followed hers. Wiesenthal later said that the Braunsteiner case proved something he had always believed: that time does not erase guilt. That geography does not erase guilt. That a new name, a new husband, a garden in Queens, a cup of tea on a Tuesday morning, none of it erases what a person chose to do. He believed that as long as even one survivor was still alive, the moral clock had not stopped ticking. And he was right. The women who stood in that Düsseldorf courtroom and pointed across the room, they did not do it for revenge. Many of them said the same thing in interviews afterward. They did it so that the children who were dragged away would not be forgotten, so that a name would be attached to what happened, so that history would not be allowed to call it anonymous. They gave the horror a face, and they gave it a verdict. Hermine Braunsteiner was not a general. She was not a high-ranking architect of the Holocaust. She was a guard, a woman who chose every single day to do more than was asked of her. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth this story leaves us with, that atrocity is rarely built only by monsters at the top. It is maintained, enforced, and deepened by ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in the dark. Remember that the next time someone tells you that history is just about the powerful, it isn't. It's about every single person who decided, in a moment when no one was grading them, who they were going to be. That decision is the whole story. It always has been. If this video made you think, share it. The people in that courtroom spent their lives making sure this story survived. The least we can do is keep it moving. Subscribe to Nazi Dark History, and I'll see you in the next one.